So what do we do about abnormal behavior? How do we treat it? How do we help it? How do we get rid of some of this behavior that's causing people problems and costing money and causing danger and all of this stuff? Well, depends on where and when you are. So let's go through some of the historical methods of treating abnormal behavior and psychological maladies, and then move a little closer to what we do now. So if you go back into ancient history, prehistory, there were at least a couple of treatments available to folks who were suffering in one way or another psychologically, although they certainly wouldn't have called it that, right? In the ancient days, to the best of our understanding and the best of our knowledge, we recognize that we don't have many records from now, so a lot of this is guesswork and guesstimation. But it seems that a lot of what we would today recognize as mental illness was attributed to the work of evil spirits, right? Someone was being possessed by an evil spirit, and it was causing them to behave strangely or badly, right? Um, Now, in some cases, in order to help somebody who was possessed, and again, a lot of this is guesswork. We don't necessarily have many documents that detail this sort of thing, but we've got skulls of people from as far back as the Stone Age, where there are holes in their skulls, like you see in this picture right here. And as you look at the holes in those skulls, there is bone growth after the the incision, meaning that that's somebody who had that piece of skull removed and then survived and continued living, because there's continued growth there in the skull bones. So best we can figure is that what they were doing is drilling out the top of the skull to let the demons out of the top of their head and let the evil spirits out. Um, and occasionally it worked. Now, why might this work? Well, there's a couple of hypotheses. There are certain kinds of infections that can cause strange behavior and disordered behavior that also involve infections in the brain, swelling in the brain, essentially. Now, the more pressure you get on certain parts of the brain, the more that will mess up the behavior that part of the brain is responsible for. So if you remove a bit of the skull and allow the brain to essentially swell beyond the borders of the skull, that's the body's response to an infection, is inflammation, right? Things puff up. And so if that inflammation was then allowed to run its course, the swelling would eventually go down as the infection resolved itself. And so that person, having that pressure on the brain relieved, would experience a relief from some of those strange symptoms of disordered behavior. And so the people would go, great, we cut a hole in their skull and the demon left and they acted normally, and then they healed and recovered. That is a practice called trephination, and not something we really do anymore. And of course, the more standard treatment of exorcism, of casting out demons, whether that was through beating the person, or submersion in icy water, or prayers, or bloodletting, or some combination of all of these, all likely factored into these types of treatments. As you can imagine, given that not many of the disorders that we deal with now deal with actual swelling of the brain, um, and the presumed ineffectiveness of exorcism in dealing with most psychological disorders that we deal with now, not a whole lot of success, I would imagine, amongst the sufferers. Now, you move a little bit further in time into the Greek and Roman eras, where we have some better records that have been kept, and we start to have some extensive writings from our philosophers and those who are interested in medicine, and we start to get an emerging view of folks who um, offered a vast array of different explanations as for why people might engage in abnormal behavior. You certainly continue to see those who talked about the work of evil spirits and demons, But amongst those, you also found others who looked at different views and, in fact, tried to look for naturalistic reasons why people might be behaving the way that they were. Hippocrates, who was commonly referred to as the father of modern medicine, um, taught that illnesses both in the body and in the mind had physical causes. And now he was talking about the four humors, right? So they didn't have necessarily the medical understanding that we have now, and so they thought that the action of the body was governed by four different humors. There was black bile, yellow bile, blood, and phlegm. And if those four liquids were out of balance in your body, then that caused illness and dysfunction. And so he tried to rebalance those humors in a variety of different ways. You can see some of the different treatments, some of which look more palatable than others. I think I'll skip out on the last one for sure, and probably the one before that. And actually, if I'm being honest, the one before that. Nevertheless, you can see some of these are things that we recommend even today for mild to moderate psychological symptoms. You know, if you're unhappy and things aren't going well for you, quite frequently what you need is to stop eating Taco Bell and take a walk, right? Now, that's not going to solve everybody's problems, certainly not our more severe psychological issues, but in a lot of cases that you can see a lot of crossover there. Now, you move past the classical era and into the Middle Ages, and things get a little muddier. Now, what I present here, I recognize is an oversimplification of what was actually a pretty complex and progressive era that we call the Middle Ages. It wasn't just, you know, everybody living in pig poop and nobody could read. There were advancements happening all over the world and in the sort of European world as well, in science and in religion and in all sorts of fields. But that can be true while at the same time the stuff that I'm going to say right now also holds true. It's just a slightly more nuanced view. At any rate, the Catholic Church at this time had an outsized influence on politics and on public policy and the control of states. And they were very interested, at least during some eras, in keeping knowledge and literacy to themselves, and really resisted changes to the systems that had been presented, the knowledge systems that had been presented, and as a result found themselves frequently at odds with philosophers and budding scientists, and trying to suppress those new influences in order to preserve their own power and supremacy. And as a result, you saw an increase in the influence of demonology, for lack of a better word, the presumption that disordered behavior came from demonic possession, and a decrease in the percentage of folks who believed that these things came from more natural causes. So you did tend to see less advancement in the medical sciences during this time, and especially in the psychological sciences, in terms of taking care of people and in terms of the difficulties they're having in their minds. Treatments ranged from exorcism to torture, and gradually, as demonology started to lose its sway amongst the lay folk, gradually you started to see the emergence of hospitals where folks could go to get more reliable care, and that tended to serve an entire community. Now, that wasn't necessarily just for mental ailments, but rather for anybody who was sick or troubled in one way or the other. Now we're moving towards the Renaissance, and you started to see a rise in scientific knowledge and inquiry. And so you started to get more people looking into some of these health problems to try to solve them. A guy named Weyer is commonly held to be the first mental health physician, where he was bringing back around this idea that diseases of the mind were physical, just in the same way that sicknesses of the body were. And so you started to see not just hospitals, but places dedicated to the care of troubled individuals. Some of these had been religious shrines previously. There's a place named Geel, I think that's how you say that. I want to say it's in Belgium. That were community health programs essentially before such things were called that. And you also started to see the rise of what we call asylums, which were places that were specifically intended for those with madness or mental illness, where they could receive treatments. Now, frequently these asylums were poorly funded and understaffed, and ended up being places where people with mental disorders were very poorly treated and subjected to treatments that were not helpful at all, but were more or less just torture. Um, but at least we're now moving towards folks with mental disorders have their own spot where they can go for treatment, even if that treatment was not necessarily helpful or advantageous at first. Now, you get towards the 19th century, the 1800s, and you start to see the care of mental health disorders improving, where you get people advocating for the humane treatment of the mad, or the mentally disturbed, or the insane, or however they would have termed it. Um, and that made its way across the ocean here into the United States, where we get the advocation of moral treatment of those in asylums. You can see the individuals involved there, Benjamin Rush and Dorothea Dix, where they really made a strong push to improve the conditions in asylums, so that people were actually, they became places of refuge and quiet and health and healing, so that people could repair whatever disorders they were dealing with. Now, unfortunately, the moral treatment movement didn't survive very well. It tended to cost a lot of money and not have many advocates, and money was always needed elsewhere for railroads and whatever else. And so by the time the 20th century came around, a lot of those advances had collapsed. Now, moving into the 20th century now, the 1900s, early part of the century, you actually had two different perspectives that dueled with each other as to which was really the truth as to what was going on with folks suffering from mental health disorders. The first was the somatogenic perspective, which once again says that our mental health disorders come from imbalances in the body. And this was definitely going down the right road, but at the time there were not many medical tools available to help or to fix these physical causes of mental illness. And in fact, we didn't even know what those physical causes were just yet. It wasn't until more effective medications started to come out mid-century or so that this view started to gain ascendancy, because even if you recognize what's going on, if you can't accurately help the individual, it doesn't matter if you know what's going on. The other perspective was the psychogenic perspective, and this one held more sway at first and then sort of balanced out with the somatogenic perspective as we moved into the mid-century. So psychogenic perspective says that mental illnesses comes from disorders or abnormal functioning in the mind. The primary proponents here were Franz Mesmer, the father of mesmerism, which is sort of the precursor to hypnotism, which is still sometimes used in therapy today, although asterisk, it's usually not effective. And then Sigmund Freud, who became one of the biggest names in psychology, and his theory of psychoanalysis held sway for decades during the early part of the 1900s. His idea was that our mind is divided into the conscious and unconscious mind, and everything that we find unacceptable about ourselves, or socially inappropriate, or that we don't like, we shove out of our conscious mind and into the unconscious mind, where we can't access it. But that stuff stays there and bubbles back up to the surface at inappropriate moments and causes us to behave in ways that we don't expect to behave. Now, you've probably had the experience yourself where you're like looking in the mirror and you're like, why did I just do that? Why am I like this? What's wrong with me? We behave. This is an influential theory, continues to be so, despite the fact that some of Freud's weirder ideas about sexuality and the development of personality in children have since been debunked as non-scientific. This idea of the presence of the unconscious mind influencing our behavior continues to be relevant even today, and continues to get studied. Um, but he was the one who pioneered talk therapy. You know, that thing that you see on TV, like I was saying, where people sit down on a couch and talk about their childhoods. Freud was the one who came up with that. He called it psychoanalytic therapy, psychoanalysis. Um, and it survives even today. And psychology has continued to be shaped by some of his ideas. So those are the two perspectives that you see. And then, like I was saying, um, well, we'll get to current treatments here in just a second. Now, there has been a sort of cultural shift in the West. I don't mean I mean Western culture generally, like the United States and Europe and Canada and whatever, not just the West of the United States. Um, if you were to go back to mid-century 1950s or even earlier in the 1920s, 1930s, folks widely distrusted psychologists for messing with people's minds and messing with things that they didn't necessarily understand. Um, and while some of this was uninformed, some of these attitudes were not without basis. There are plenty of horror stories, if you want to go looking for them, of well-meaning psychologists who provided um, therapeutic regimens for folks who ended up hurting them severely, um, because they weren't depending on good science to come up with their ideas for their treatments. They just sort of looked at the world around them and said, "Here, I think this is what's going on." I mean, this was Freud to a T, right? He just looked at the world around him and saw the troubles that people were having and said, I think that a lot of your problems with your behavior stems from the fact that when you were a child, you had a very poor relationship with your mother or with your father or etc. Right? Without necessarily, collecting the data to know whether or not that was true. Now, in his defense, a lot of these folks' defense, a lot of the methods for this data gathering and scientific inquiry didn't yet exist. Were still being developed. So unrealistic to expect them to have put those to use. Nevertheless, it did lead to abuses here and there within psychology. And so you got a lot of folks. And in fact, this still exists today. I remember bringing somebody to my house to work on my sprinklers. Older fellow, probably was in his 70s, still stronger and sprier than I am at age 40. But he was working on my sprinklers, and I was out there with him. And he's like, "So what do you do?" And I said, "I teach." "Oh, what do you teach?" "Psychology." And he went like this. "Huh." I was like, "Huh? What does that mean? Huh?" And so I couldn't quite understand what his issue was, but he did not want to talk to me once he knew that I taught psychology. And it was a really awkward conversation after that. He did not trust psychologists. And this was very common in earlier eras and still continues some today, obviously. But there has been a shift there as we have tried to move more towards evidence-based treatments where we can show that, hey, this works. This has worked for other people, so let's try it on you, right? And as a result, then, as we started to get more effective treatments within psychology, you started to get more and more folks recognizing the reality of mental illness and being willing to seek treatment for it. And this is something that continues to change even now, with it being more and more acceptable to discuss mental illness and to seek treatment rather than being ostracized for, going to see a shrink, right? So what changed in the mid-1950s? Well, we started to develop some effective drugs that we didn't have before. Antipsychotic drugs for the treatment of schizophrenia and other related disorders. These are also known as psychotropic drugs. That's going to show up in your quiz. The development of antidepressants, anti-anxiety drugs, all sort of at the beginning part of the 20th century, and became popularized by the 50s and 60s. Now, there are problems that developed because of the development of these drugs. However, one of the immediate effects was that folks who could not manage their lives before, who needed to be in inpatient mental institutions, And we didn't have any effective treatments for them. So pretty much everybody with schizophrenia, lots of folks with personality disorders and whatnot, they needed to be cared for in their own mental hospitals. And suddenly, with the development of Thorazine and some of these other antipsychotics, they could manage their lives again. They were able to, a lot of their symptoms just disappeared, and they could go and try and get a job again and feed themselves and pay their rent and all that stuff. And so as a result, you can see the inpatient population in the Western world just plummeted over the course of 30 years or so. And a lot of the mental health hospitals shut down because there weren't enough people there paying the money for them to keep the doors open. In fact, there used to be a mental health hospital up by Seven Peaks in Provo that shut down when I lived here as a teenager. 1989, 1990, 1992, somewhere around there. For very much this reason, there just weren't enough folks to keep the doors open anymore. Now, this seems like a good thing, right? This is folks who couldn't manage their lives before who now can. Awesome. However, keeping track of these folks in order to keep them getting their medication turned out to be a real problem. And so what happened is as a lot of these folks moved out of inpatient scenarios and back home, they would take their meds for a while, and then for whatever reason, either because they couldn't afford them or couldn't get access to them, or they didn't like the side effects, or whatever the case might be, stopped taking their medication, began having the same mental health care troubles they were having before, and ended up homeless. And so the deinstitutionalization, the shutting down of all of these mental health hospitals from 1960 through 1980s is more or less directly responsible for the homelessness problem that we have in the United States now, and an unexpected knock-on effect of the development of these pretty effective drugs. Now, should we have not developed Thorazine or Xanax or any of these others? No, not necessarily. But even our solutions sometimes have teeth. It's a little unfortunate. Okay, now, in terms of the treatment of severe disorders, excuse me, as I mentioned, before 1950, a lot of this was happening in inpatient scenarios, and if it was if it wasn't somebody who needed to be in a mental health care facility, then these were handled by private therapists on a case-by-case basis, where they were prescribing the medication that the individual needed and giving them the therapy that they needed. That has changed over the last couple of generations to where now a lot of this is mediated by your insurance, right? Insurance companies hold a lot of sway over what treatment you're going to get because they're the ones who are paying for the bulk of it. Insurance covers more mental health issues than it ever did before. And so it's not a negative thing that insurance is involved, but it has changed the face of psychotherapy, certainly. You also get more preventative measures being taken. It took us a while to get there, but eventually, sometime during the later part of the 20th century, we said, hang on, instead of just treating people when they have trouble, why don't we get to them before they have trouble and keep them from ever having trouble in the first place? It turns out to be way cheaper and way easier. And so more and more prevention programs have come online, and you get the rise of positive psychology, where instead of just studying people with problems, we study people who are functioning well and figuring out how good functioning works and then teaching people how to do that. And you also get more specialization of care, where we now have therapy modalities that exist for pretty much every disorder out there, where it's not just, oh, you have some sort of anxiety disorder, so it's a one-size-fit-all treatment for any anxiety disorder. No, there's likely to be a specific kind of treatment just for your particular disorder or malady, right? Okay, I think that's all I'm going to say on this video, and then we'll talk about some other current issues to wrap up the chapter.